Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. Great to see everybody. Coming to the Carey Institute for me it's a little bit like coming to the mothership. There's very strong connections between Cornell and the Carey Institute. In fact, the first president, Gene Likens of the Carey Institute, left Cornell, the department that I'm in now, to help found this institution. And there's just, as Josh said, some of the great ecosystem ecology in the world is going on here. So very nice to be here. And before I dive in, I don't normally do this, but I feel like I have to share this with you. You know, in the life of any biologist, their study organisms eventually take their revenge on the people studying them. And this happened to me just a few weeks ago. So if you see me fidgeting up here, one of the explanations is that I went for a run and I felt something squishy in my running shoes. I didn't care. I kept going. And the next day, my feet, my right foot, broke out in this incredible rash and really nasty, large pus bubbles. And it was, it's just the caterpillars taking their revenge on me. There was a woolly bear caterpillar that had taken up residence in my running shoes. And woolly bears are fabulous in that you can pick them up and do whatever you want with them. They're not allergenic typically, but I think when you grind their bodies into your feet, bad things happen. So I'm still recovering from that. But here we are. We're talking about monarchs and milkweeds today. I want to tell you a little bit about their basic biology and what I'll couch as coevolution. I want to tell you a little bit about the cultural history, not of monarchs and milkweeds in particular, but of the particular class of toxins that milkweeds make that are also made by a few other plants, including the foxglove. And now humans have used and abused those compounds for thousands of years. And I'll lastly talk about conservation. It seems to be on the tip of so many of our tongues, both in general, but also in terms of the decline of monarch butterflies. The decline is really quite steep and alarming. So this is the star of our show tonight, the monarch butterfly. It's just recently spent 10 days inside of a chrysalis. At the end of that incredible transformation, I mean, one of the great transformations in biology, going from the caterpillar feeding stage to the adult reproductive and flying stage, this butterfly has emerged. It drops out of its chrysalis, takes a few minutes to pump fluids through its wings, and will eventually be a dry, flying butterfly. And the monarch butterfly, we think of it as really, it's most well known in eastern North America, and that's really where the lion's share of them are, probably 1 billion or so butterflies generated east of the Rocky Mountains every year. But the monarch butterfly has been introduced and occurs in other places in the world. So there is a somewhat independent population in the western US, also native to the West Coast. This is the report from the Thanksgiving count in California indicates that it is by far the worst year yet for the California population. But then monarchs, despite their decline, have spread throughout the world in other places where their host plants, the milkweeds, have been introduced. So there are self-sustaining populations in Australia and New Zealand, in Spain and Northern Africa, on Hawaii. And the plants, the milkweeds, have been introduced as ornamentals, and basically every so often the butterflies take to the wind, really with the long distance in mind, and are able to establish populations in those places. For many, many years in the UK, there's many decades, about every 50 years, there are monarchs reported in the UK. And in fact, they have made it across the Atlantic, but because there isn't milkweed there, they're not self-sustaining populations there. And the star of our show on the plant side, the food side of the monarch butterfly, is the milkweed. This is the common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca. Linnaeus gave it its name. It's another interesting story in and of itself I don't have time to get into today. But this is the dominant species that is certainly in New York State, that 90-some% of the monarchs that make it to Mexico have fed upon as a caterpillar. And it is also a host to many, many other interesting animals, about 12 other insect species that make their living only by feeding on the milkweed. Now, I like to present the biology of the monarch and the milkweed as largely an antagonistic affair. The milkweed doesn't want to have anything to do with the monarch. It's not beneficial The monarch is not beneficial in any way to the milkweed. And the monarch wants nothing else to do but then to eat this host plant. And every year, the evolutionary battle that has been waged over the last many millennia unfolds in sort of a three-stage act, or set of acts, when the monarchs are flying back from Mexico every spring, late spring and early summer. And the story starts something like this relatively innocent-looking picture where the milkweeds, they're all perennial plants. They emerge from their dormant rootstocks in May and June. The monarchs have been overwintering in Mexico, and they're flying back. They encounter a relatively clean emerging milkweed from like this, and it lays an egg on the leaf. And what ensues is what I call the natural history of coevolution, the plant mounting barriers to feeding, and the animal, in this case, the monarch, overcoming those barriers. 4 days after the egg is laid, it hatches, and the first thing that egg must do is clear the lawn. The first barrier to feeding for this monarch caterpillar are going to be the thick hairs on the underside of the milkweed leaf. I sometimes think about this as the sand in my salad, or some other physical barrier to consumption. And what the monarch does, it is just amazing. Before it gets any nutrition out of the leaf, before it sinks its mandibles and consumes that leaf, it first clears those hairs away. It might take 45 minutes, it's clipping them away, it's not ingesting them, it's basically clearing the landscape so that it can sink its mandibles into the leaf. So in the natural history of coevolution, every barrier or defense that the plant puts up to protect itself is overcome in some way by the animals that are trying to eat them. And that first barrier are the hairs, botanically the trichomes, that are shaved by the monarchs. Well, the next barrier is pretty incredible also, and it is the pressurized latex that occurs inside of the milkweed leaves. Hopefully all of you have at some point broken a milkweed leaf and seen that white sticky substance. Well, about 10% of all flowering plants produce latex. It's not a rare or a uncommon trait. And latex has no known physiological or primary function for the plant other than defense against bugs. This monarch shaved its little area. It took its first few bites of the milkweed, and what happened was it was overwhelmed by a droplet of latex that carried it and eventually glued it dead to the leaf. Now, what is so stunning about this is that this animal's only food as a caterpillar is the milkweed. And yet 30 to 50% of all monarchs in nature die this kind of death mired in milkweed latex. It is an intense battle, and it is a very difficult first couple of days of life for the monarch butterfly caterpillars. They've shaved their trichomes, they now sink their mandibles into the leaf, and they're coping with this very sticky, toxic substance. Now, some fraction of them make it through, and especially once they get larger, they do something that we call the vein drain. So this is a milkweed leaf. This is actually the tropical milkweed. It doesn't quite have as much latex as does our common milkweed, but you can see the latex there. What the monarch will do is spend, again, 20, 30, 50 minutes draining or deactivating the canals that are delivering that latex to the rest of the plant. This caterpillar isn't feeding, but if there was a bubble above its head, it'd be pretty proud of itself right now, because the leaf is basically getting notched. The latex delivering canals here are getting severed. The leaf is eventually hanging down, very pleased. You often will see milkweed leaves in the field, half of them anyways, like that. And after deactivating the laticifers of the latex-bearing canals, the caterpillar might spend 10 minutes hungrily eating the rest of the leaf. So in the natural history of coevolution, every defense or barrier that's put forward by the plant is met with some offensive tactic by the herbivore. Now, the third stage occurs when the trichomes are shaved and the veins are drained, and now the caterpillar is happily munching away. But pumped through all of the leaves and all of the tissues of the milkweed are toxins that are called cardiac glycosides. In the 1950s, Dame Miriam Rothschild in the UK hypothesized that some animals, including monarchs, were gaining their own toxicity. She knew that most birds don't attack monarch caterpillars or butterflies. She hypothesized that they were gaining their toxicity by ingesting the milkweed leaves. And she worked with a fellow named Lincoln Brower to demonstrate that. And Lincoln Brower did some amazing experiments where he grew monarch caterpillars on milkweeds that had the toxins and those that didn't. And he had a wonderful assay that he used to use to address whether, in fact, the monarchs were themselves toxic. Naive blue jays, and you'd be a little more hard-pressed to do these experiments these days, but he would take naive blue jays, which were happy to eat monarch butterflies, and quite regularly, after about 12 minutes after eating one of these butterflies, the blue jays would vomit in response to the toxins that the butterflies had packed away from the milkweed plants. Well, this was a sensation. A lot of biology textbooks, when I was as an undergraduate at Penn, they referred to this as Brower's barfing blue jays. Because 12 minutes after feeding on the monarchs, they would vomit. But again, the key point here is that in the natural history of coevolution, if you're going to specialize and only eat a plant like the milkweed, you got to shave the trichomes, you got to deactivate the latex, and then you got to figure out what to do with the toxins. And I'm not going to get into the genetics and biochemistry of how they deal with the cardiac glycosides, but it is also a fabulous story. Not only are they not sensitive to it, but they pack it away in their own bodies and are then using it in their own defense against their enemies like the birds. So they're feeding away. Some fraction of them make it. They transform from the caterpillar stage to the chrysalis. That happens in about 30 minutes. They shed their skin. They're very, very soft at this stage, but you can kind of see, you can begin to see the adult butterfly shape here in the hardening chrysalis. And after 10 days to 2 weeks, they begin to emerge. The chrysalis turns black. The butterfly drops out, and the next stage begins. Now here, folks, I need to dispel a widely held myth about monarch butterflies, and it has to do with something I told you earlier, which is that the milkweed and the monarch are antagonists. The milkweed doesn't get any benefit from the monarch. Many people think that monarchs are important pollinators, either of milkweeds or of other plants. But as it turns out, and this is one of these things I feel strongly about, it's important to get the science right. Butterflies in general are not particularly good pollinators of almost any plants. But monarchs are especially poor pollinators of the milkweed. And it's because of something that milkweeds share in common with orchids. They're really the only two groups of plants that, instead of having free-flowing pollen grains that might be collected up by bees and moved around, instead, they have packages that we call pollinia that are basically groupings of those pollens in a little structure. And the way the big, I often like to think of it as clumsy, monarch sits on a milkweed flower, it basically never really comes into contact with that pollinia structure so that it could move around the pollen packets. Here the monarch is, yes, it's happily drinking the nectar, that's its proboscis or its tongue. But the pollinia, if it were to be an important pollinator, sits right here where that little black or dark spot is. And if we zoom in, that's where that spot is. And the way pollination works is a large-bodied bee would be moving its spiny arms or legs through that and would pull out the pollinia structure. You can see the pollen grains packed away in there. Then later, after that pollinia has attached to the bee's leg and the bee is now crawling all over another flower, it gets inserted into a slit that's right there. Those pollen grains then germinate, fertilize the ovules, and we have plant mating. The monarchs are simply not doing that for the milkweed plant. Okay, so we have the caterpillar stage, we have the adult stage, they're not pollinators. Where are we in the life cycle of the monarch butterfly? We're in the frozen north here in December, the monarchs have made their journey flying from the northern climes of southern Ontario and certainly all throughout New York in their southern migration and made it to Mexico. So they're there now. For this half of the year, beginning in September when they begin their flight, to the 2,000-3,000 miles they fly, to the overwintering they do in the highlands of Mexico, and I'll show you pictures of that in a minute, they're not really dependent on milkweed because the adult butterflies only drink through that straw and they only drink nectar and water. In the other half of the year, beginning in March, they leave Mexico. They have a northern flight. They arrive to the Gulf states, primarily in Texas, where they mate, lay eggs, and die. And those eggs are laid on the Texan milkweeds, and they have a generation there. And then there's 2 to 3 more generations as they move north to areas east of the Appalachians where we are, as well as west of the Appalachians in the Midwest. They kind of loosely are divided after they migrate north from Mexico. I often think about, and this is going to be important for the end of today's talk, I often think of the life cycle as beginning in Mexico in the wintertime, where they are now. Those same individuals fly to the first generation in the southern US, second, third, and fourth generation again in the west or on the east. They then fly south in the fall, all funneling back to the Mexican highlands. So in September, up here in New York, this is actually a picture from southern Ontario, the image looks something like this. Mostly not aggregated monarchs, but free flying. In the afternoon, you might see collections of 20, 40, 50 of them in a goldenrod field. But then, as fall takes hold, they get into larger and larger clusters. They're flying about 35 to 50 miles a day going south. They only fly during the day. They're spending their nights clustered on trees. And 2 months later, they arrive to the Mexican overwintering sites. 10,000 feet of elevation, about 50 kilometers from Mexico City, are very tall neovolcanic mountaintops. There are these large open natural fields. They're called llanos at about 10,000 feet of elevation. And there's some inkling, some idea that the monarchs may actually be using these open fields in their navigation to find the very specific places where they overwinter. And then where they overwinter, they're largely clustered on those trees, incredible densities. So a square meter this size, if we look upwards in a place that has dense monarchs, it's 5,000 butterflies. And they're mostly huddled together, but on warm days when it's over about 55 degrees Celsius, they'll take to the air. Mostly they're heading to the streams to drink some water. There really aren't things flowering at that point because we're at 10,000 feet of elevation, even though we're in central Mexico. And you know, it's just, if you haven't gone, you should go. It's just crazy. It's really spectacular. These are all butterflies weighing down these fir trees that, again, are they're cold weather trees in part because we're at such high elevation. And on a warm day, you can look up in the sky and see jillions of butterflies, and they just coat the surfaces. And you know, if you're from the air, this is an aerial image of Lincoln Browers. The orange that you see here isn't dead conifers. It is, in fact, dense butterflies coating those trees. After the overwintering period, the springtime, again, brings them back. There are 130 species of milkweed in North America. We largely think of the common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca, and it is the dominant host plant. As is true in much of ecology, there are few really abundant or common species, but most species are rare. So the 125 other milkweed species that we have in North America are relatively rare, but they're there and they are host plants for the monarch butterfly. Okay. I think we're doing well on time. I think before I dive into the next section, I'm going to take any quick questions people have, anything they want to talk about or ask. Go ahead.
What do they eat in the winter when they're wintering over?
Can you repeat the question?
The question is, what do they eat in the winter when they're overwintering in Mexico? They eat just water and floral nectar, and the lion's share of that is water because they're at 10,000 feet of elevation in central Mexico where there's very little inflower. So one of the really just mind-blowing things about these organisms is they have 4 generations a year. One of those generations lives for 8 months. It was a caterpillar in late July, became a butterfly sometime in August or early September. It flew all the way to Mexico. It hangs out in trees for 4 months and then flies back to Texas. That's its life cycle. The next 3 generations, egg to caterpillar to adult to death, 1 month each. It's one of those unbelievable mysteries, right? Where the same organism, through its 4 generations in the annual cycle, has such differences. But during those months in Mexico, just to answer your question, it's mostly water, keeping themselves going. The cool temperatures are really important in a way to not expend too much energy because they need to basically survive until the springtime. Go ahead.
Please tell us about the complexity of getting to visit them in Mexico.
How it's difficult. The question has to do with the complexity of getting to the sites in Mexico. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's pretty short drive from Mexico City, but then you're at very high elevation, so you're a little out of breath. And the facilities are pretty good now. I mean, there's parking lots with buses and whatever. I think 3 of the sanctuaries are open to the public, and the others are not. Go ahead.
I wonder what your view is about a couple of groups here in the Mid-Hudson region who actually found out how to raise the milkweed and breed the butterflies and then release them. Do they somehow contribute to the larger success of the butterflies, or is it a problem?
The question is mass rearing of monarchs beneficial? I have a lot to say about that. I won't say all of it. I would say that it's certainly possible that it could be beneficial, but there's many potential pitfalls of mass rearing of monarchs, one of which is that they easily get disease, some of which isn't visible. And so especially at high densities when you rear them inside, it's known that they get higher levels of disease. And we wouldn't want to be releasing those outside, but I think many of them do get released. The more complicated or interesting facets have to do with, I think, the extent to which we can control nature or fix the problems we've created by kind of band-aids or by supplementing the population as opposed to treating the causes. But those are maybe more philosophical issues. I wonder if I should move on and take more questions later. I'm very interested in talking about all of this. Just looking at the clock up there. We're moving on, folks. Cultural history. So I've told you a little bit about the toxins that the milkweeds make. They're called cardiac glycosides. And there is, as I've also said, there's a tremendous diversity of the milkweeds themselves. They all make these toxins. And if you think about all the plants in the world, including non-milkweeds, that make these cardiac glycosides, it's probably some thousands of them. But the lion's share of them, the bulk of them, are in one family of plants, the Apocynaceae, or the family that has the milkweeds. But in 11 other families, through a process we call convergent evolution, the same toxins have independently evolved. And one of those families is the Plantaginaceae, or the family that has foxglove. And foxglove is famous to gardeners, beautiful flowers, but they're also famous because of the toxins that they make, which are the same class as the milkweeds. And what I want to tell you a little bit about is how some of these toxins have been used throughout history by humans. And I want to start by moving thousands of years into the past, where not only did evolution by natural selection result in the independent evolution or independent origin of these cardiac glycosides in multiple different groups of plants, but also 4 cultures independently arrived at utilizing those extracts from those plants medicinally. In North Africa, it was a plant called squill in the asparagus family that they were using. In Europe, it was foxglove, and in North America, it was the milkweeds. And in all cases, these 3 cultures, and they weren't emailing each other or finding the remedy on Twitter. It was independent origins of treating congestive heart failure through the plant extracts of these 3 plant families that had independently evolved those toxins. But I said there were 4 cultures, and there's only 3 here. And the 4th has to do with Chinese medicine, where they didn't use a plant that had cardiac glycosides. They utilized the one group of animals that independently and also evolved to make cardiac glycosides in their defense. The toads make cardiac glycosides in a secretion, a defensive secretion that they make when they're threatened. And it's not latex, although it sort of looks like it, doesn't it? That same secretion was utilized in Chinese medicine to treat the same ailments. Now, the Europeans used foxglove extracts not only to treat congestive heart failure, but also as a rat poison. And that it teaches us one of the fundamental axioms of chemistry or chemical ecology, as it were. It's something that Paracelsus indicated or wrote 500 years ago, that dose makes the poison. The same compound at low doses can be medicinal, of course, as we all know, and at very high doses can be put to use in some other ways. Let's move forward in time from thousands of years ago. In the times of Darwin, and here I'm talking about Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, it became a little bit more widely accepted about the medicinal uses of foxglove. Here shown used to treat one of the symptoms of congestive heart failure, what was then called dropsy, which is the swelling of the extremities. And basically extracts were being used from foxglove to treat these in a more, let's say, widely accepted medical fashion. Erasmus Darwin, like perhaps most or all of the physicians of that time, were also great botanists, because so many of our pharmaceuticals come from plant and natural product extracts. I'm going to skip the 60s. There's a great story about a pharmaceutical disaster that happened in the 60s, but I don't have time for that today. I want to take you to 1981, the February 20th issue of 1981 of the Journal of the American Medical Association, where a remarkable hypothesis was put forward by a medical doctor about Vincent van Gogh and the way he painted. And it has to do with the same group of toxins. I don't love to do this, but I want to, usually, these scientific papers are impenetrable, even for somebody like me, but I want to read with you the abstract of the paper in JAMA published in 1981. So this is a hypothesis that has basically stood the test of time, folks. Vincent van Gogh, the Dutch post-impressionist painter, died in 1890. He was an uncommon man. Automutilation, depression, insanity, and suicide are all part of his medical history. During the last 2 years of his life, his paintings were characterized by halos and the color yellow. And it was an abrupt shift 2 years before he died, this yellows and halos. Van Gogh was likely under the influence of digitalis intoxication. This hypothesis is based on his twice having painted his physician, Dr. Gachet, having painted his physician holding a foxglove plant, that this medicine was used in the latter part of the 19th century in the treatment of epilepsy, which is something that Van Gogh suffered from, and that the toxic effects of digitalis may have in part dictated the artist's technique. What we now know is that when cardiac glycosides are still prescribed to treat congestive heart failure. It's not the dominant treatment, but it's certainly one that is still prescribed. And like all of us know, medication is one of these things where getting the dose right sometimes takes a little bit of troubleshooting. We're all different. And the way doctors know if the cardiac glycosides that you're taking, the dose needs to be lowered, is that you start to see halos and have yellow vision. That comes before vomiting. But what this and there were all kinds of hypotheses about Van Gogh, the absinthe, the staring at the sun, all of those things. And it's been controversial, but more or less, this hypothesis has stood the test of time, that he changed the way he painted in part in response to this medication that he was taking for his epilepsy. And I'll just leave you with a brief note about where we are today. Around that same time in 1980, there was a compilation of studies being conducted. We call these meta-analyses in science, much like what Erasmus Darwin did. He collected 200 case studies of where people had been given digitalis extract and what their outcome was. In 1980, there was a compilation of studies going on looking at the survivorship of patients in response to breast cancer. And one of the statistically significant factors that emerged was that those patients that were also taking cardiac glycosides for their heart condition had a higher rate of survivorship with regard to the breast cancer. And that led to the past essentially 40 years of additional research looking at what the relationship between cardiac glycosides is with anti-cancer or suppression of cancer proliferation. And I think my understanding is that currently there are human clinical trials going on in terms of using variants of these cardiac glycosides as a treatment of certain kinds of cancer. So, one of the things about the chemical ecology of milkweed, it sounds so special, and well, it really is. But really every plant that's out there and every interaction that's out there has some similar complex story to tell. It's actually not that special. It's just that they are the deep mysteries, some of which that we have been able to uncover and others of which we have not yet uncovered. Should I stop and take a couple of questions? Is that yeah, I'll take a couple of questions before we move on to conservation. If anybody has any. Go ahead.
Is there any danger of deforestation in Mexico where they overwinter? I thought I read something about that.
The question is there any danger of deforestation in Mexico where the butterflies overwinter? Absolutely. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. The protections in Mexico began in the early 80s, and they've become more and more and more stringent. But there's just the fundamental conflict between wildlife preservation and the human societies that live there. And there's people that are trying to make a living, and so there's a tension there. I'll talk more about that as I move forward. Yeah, go ahead.
I understand that there are two birds that actually eat monarchs.
Yes.
And then there's the species of the milkweed beetle. And I wonder if there's any significance to the fact that these are all orange and black, like the monarch butterfly.
The question has to do with the two birds that eat monarchs in the overwintering colonies. They eat jillions of them. And the other insects that are on milkweed that are orange and black. Is there any significance to the coloration? Absolutely. A hallmark, a very general principle in biology is that toxic animals tend to color themselves with high contrasting colors. It's not always orange and black. Sometimes it's like the monarch caterpillar, white, yellow, black. There are other combinations, but we call that, of course, we have technical terms for all this stuff. We call it aposematism. And so it's a very general, but it's not a physiological linkage. It's not that toxic animals have to be those colors. It is that they are two different signals, one of which provides information to the predator prior to consumption to let the predator know that the organism is toxic. And there's a lot of, I could be here all night, and there's a lot of great basic biology with regard to something we call the life dinner principle, which is for a predator, if it bites the caterpillar, doesn't like it, it can spit it out. So for the predator, but for the caterpillar, it's its life. It may be bitten and spit out, but it's dead now. And so through evolution by natural selection, there are these other signals that have evolved to provide information. And the community of insects that are on milkweed, as an example, there's many of those species, they share a lot of that coloration. And it is not due to a shared physiology or a shared a recent ancestry. It's really independent origin of the coloration. Go ahead.
In the generation that lasts for 8 months,
I'm sorry.
I'm outside.
Oh, you're outside.
I know, it's amazing. In the generation that lasts for 8 months,
yes.
how long are they a chrysalis and how long are they butterflies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I assume I don't have to repeat the question. They are a chrysalis for the same amount of time, that same 10 to 14 days. They are a caterpillar for the same amount of time, that 10 to 14 days. They are an adult for 7.5 months as opposed to an adult for 2 to 3 weeks. So it's really that adult stage that is different about them.
Thank you.
Last question up here. Yeah, go ahead.
Have scientists been tracking the effects of what we think of now very much as extreme weather, the tornadoes? I wonder if the
The question is, to what extent is extreme weather and climate change contributing to the population decline? I'll talk more about that in a minute. I'd say that it's very clear that climate in general, not climate change, that climate in general is, the monarch population is very sensitive to that. So fabulous long-term data and modeling indicates that spring rains in Texas really are important for the number of monarchs that get generated in the Northeast and the Midwest. It's sort of the inertia of that first population, that first generation that happens down there coming up. I would say that largely what we have about climate change, direct linkage to monarch decline, is anecdotal. And there's various things that we can talk about later, about the timeline of monarch decline and of how it corresponds to climate change and that kind of thing. There are many, many climate change concerns with monarchs for sure, and I'll show some of those in a minute. But I'd say it's one of the amazing things about the scale of this problem, as is the case with so many conservation problems, is the annual life cycle of this animal encompasses 3 countries across the continent, and there are 4 generations in these different seasons and the migration, so it's pretty complicated. I think I'm going to move on, but I'll just because I can finish on time, and then we'll take more questions. Sorry, thank you for holding. So conservation, the first thing to say about monarch conservation in particular is that it wasn't a topic of discussion until the mid-70s, and the reason is until we understood where they went in the winter, it was hard to understand how fragile and special their annual life cycle was. Now, in the 1940s, Nora and Fred Urquhart in southern Ontario began a program to understand where monarchs went in the winter. Of course, there was a small pocket of native people in Mexico that knew there were butterflies, jillions of them coming to these areas. But there was very little communication between those indigenous folks and even Mexican lepidopterists. So if you look at the book, Butterflies of Mexico, written by Mexican lepidopterists in the 1960s, there isn't pages in there devoted to the overwintering sites. So in southern Ontario and throughout the US, it was quite well known that they were flying south in the winter, but it wasn't clear where they went. So Fred and Nora Urquhart started a program of tagging the butterflies in the 1940s with a little tag that said, if you find this, send it back to us at this address and tell us where you got it. In 1955, they had enlisted 200 citizen scientists throughout Canada and the US, and they were tagging butterflies, they were exchanging information. It was really, really cool. And this was the Urk Hearts Hypothesis, basically in the late 50s. Maybe it's from 1955. So we had this redrawn, but basically they thought that each dot is one of those citizen scientists, and they thought that the butterflies would fly south, kind of hang out around the coast here, jump over to California, and then make it back in the spring. But through additional research, and they ultimately had about 2,500 citizen scientists by the early 1970s, and they knew that they were going further and further and further south into Mexico, but they didn't know where. So it turned out it was a couple lived in Mexico City that loved to go riding on their motorcycles into the mountains about 50 kilometers outside of Mexico City that had read the newspaper article that the Urquharts had written and had discovered the overwintering sites in the highlands of Mexico. And it was an international sensation, right? I mean, basically in 1975, these incredible butterflies, which were known to many, many people throughout the world, but we didn't know what their life cycle was or where they went in the winter. It wasn't, again, announced on the evening news, or it was announced in the August 1976 issue of National Geographic. And it was just amazing. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the next story I was going to tell just so that we can move on. But what the findings at that time indicated, and they demonstrated, and it turned out to be true, is that east of the Rockies, in these millions of square miles of breeding habitat in the summer, where up to 1 billion butterflies are produced, they are all going to overwinter on about 12 mountaintops in central Mexico. And it's this narrow band of fir forests at 10,000 feet of elevation to 10,800 feet of elevation. Above that, there's not much soil or trees. And below that, it's too warm where they can't stay in that kind of physiological stasis mode that they need to be in for those 4 months. So the conservation conversation began almost immediately in 1977. Why? Because it was recognized that despite the hundreds of millions of butterflies that we see, an essential part of that annual cycle was this bottleneck in this place the size of New York City in central Mexico on these little mountaintops. And immediately, logging at the overwintering grounds was something that was widely discussed back in 1977. It continues to be an issue. Climate change and extreme weather, I'm going to show you another picture in a moment. About every 5 to 10 years at those overwintering sites that are held at about 45 degrees Fahrenheit, in the wintertime, there'll be a massive snow or ice storm up there. And it's a little bit unclear to me. I'd say that there haven't been enough of them to know from that site to know whether the frequency has been increasing, because it is only every 5 or 10 years. And the records only go back to 1977 with regard to those freezing events. Habitat loss in the most general sense has been widely discussed, insecticides and genetically modified organisms. And the current thing that's on everybody's lips is the lack of milkweed and the fact that we've sprayed so many herbicides on our agricultural fields, cleaning them of milkweed and therefore not providing host plants for the monarchs. This is just one of these images. This is the 2002 winter die-off where 70% of the monarchs were killed. They literally were frozen on the leaves. They then dropped to the ground. This is an undergraduate assistant of Lincoln Brower's that is literally in half a meter of dead butterflies. And the data, and I don't want to show you a lot of data, folks, but the data, any way you look at it, is not good. The data from Mexico, where they basically measure the area of forest occupied, because they're so dense they can't count them all, is precipitously been declining. And where we are now, this is last year, this data was released a year ago, seems to be stabilized at this kind of low level of 4 hectares of forest occupied. And I think last summer everybody agreed was perhaps the biggest monarch breeding year that we can remember, at least in the last 15 years. So the hopes are that these numbers will be somewhat higher. They'll be released in January or February. The brief controversy I want to talk about just for a minute here is that this milkweed controversy. And basically there were several papers, scientific studies that came out in 2012 that implicated migratory, the monarchs were declining in part due to the lack of milkweed. And there's all kinds of arguments. Scientists, they love to argue and to interpret data differently. And the question has remained, what is the cause of the monarch's decline? The current most widely accepted hypothesis, and it's not a hypothesis that I personally agree with, the data analyses I've done don't support it, but I think it's important to evaluate or to put it out there, is that because we've genetically modified our corn and soybean to be tolerant of herbicides, and herbicides kill plants, that allows us to kill the weeds in agricultural fields. Milkweeds are considered a weed. You spray them, the milkweed dies, but the corn doesn't, and therefore there's no food for this monarch to eat. That's a distinctly different mechanism than an insecticide argument, where insect-killing things may be sprayed on the same agricultural field. They're not impacting the milkweed, they're directly killing the monarch caterpillars. So I just want to put that out there as 2 different hypotheses, and I just think there's so much information about herbicides and pesticides and insecticides that it's important to get them right. I'm going to skip some of this. The national agenda has become plant milkweed if you want to save the monarch. And in our last administration's kitchen garden, Michelle Obama was planting milkweed alongside the lettuce and the kale because she wanted to help the pollinators. Even though they're not pollinators, but the heart was in the right place. But the bottom line is our analysis does not indicate a connection between the amount of milkweed that is on the landscape and the number of monarchs that make it to Mexico. Our analyses indicate that the number of butterflies that start here in Mexico predict the number of butterflies that make it into Texas and the Gulf states. And that generation predicts the number that make it to the Midwest. And that predicts the number that make it to start the southern migration where the butterflies are also counted. But that the break in the cycle is between the beginning of the southern migration and coming back to Mexico in the following year. Now, it's really this hypothesis that we have is based on the fact that these numbers all make sense going up. They're all connected. And in fact, we don't see declines in the number of monarchs when we count the number that are flying south at the beginning of the fall migration, whereas the numbers are certainly declining here in Mexico. That is also consistent with the numbers building up as they have 4 generations over each summer. And in fact, just to get to one of the questions that was asked earlier, why is it, or what is the potential impact of some of those infrequent winter kills or winter freezes in Mexico? The one thing that the monarchs truly have going for them in this battle, in this conservation battle, is that they have 4 generations over the summer. And so when their populations are down here, there is tremendous potential for those populations to increase because they go from egg to adult. Each adult monarch has 300 to 400 eggs. And if the population is going to stay stable, only 1 female and 1 male in the next generation have to survive. So there's tremendous potential for them to build up. Our hypothesis, or the data we have, indicate that there is a break in the cycle during the southern migration. What does that mean? It means that nectar sources, as they're flying south during the fall, may be limiting. Quite counterintuitively, these animals, monarchs, put on lipids and put on fat during that 2,000 to 3,000 mile journey south. They're drinking so much sugar that they're able to accumulate the lipids that they need to survive the winter. Insecticides, we think that they kill insects, and of course they do, but one of the kind of more insidious aspects of many pesticides is that at very low doses, they don't kill the animals, they simply disrupt their physiology. And there's now some work emerging that indicates that sublethal, or doses of the insecticides that don't kill the monarchs, sicken them, make them smaller, they have weaker muscles, and therefore they may not be able to, make the southern journey. The last 800 miles, and it is 800 miles, beginning basically at the southern Texas to Mexico, we know almost nothing about. It's likely to be one of the most stressful times in the migration. It's the end of this long migration, but there just hasn't been as much of the science and citizen science going on, although that's really taken hold now in northern Mexico over the last decade. And there is indeed continued degradation at the overwintering sites. I mean, it's a constant struggle, and there's not a right answer there because it's a complicated tension between the people that live there and the habitats that many of us would like to see protected. I'm going to end there. I'm happy to take more questions, and thank you all for listening. I field the questions? Go ahead.
So I just wondered why Peninsula Point, Michigan, and Cape May, New Jersey were highlighted on the map.
The question is, why was Peninsula Point and Cape May, Michigan highlighted on the map? There are 3 places where, for the last 20 years or 25 years, people have been counting monarch butterflies at the beginning of the southern migration. And just like the migratory birds, the geography funnels the butterflies often to peninsulas, things that stick out into water. So if you think about them as funneling points, butterflies from a large region up north eventually make their way to these tips that stick out into water, and those are great places to count the butterflies to get estimates of their population. The other place that's been done is Long Point in Ontario, and it just happens to be, it's really great that there's basically a very east and a Midwestern and one in the middle a way to census the butterflies as they're beginning the southern migration. That's a good question, thank you. Go ahead.
So you were talking about the winter environment in which they live.
Yes.
And you were saying that there are peaks and it's too high, it's too cold. So there's got to be a lot of other places like that.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't they also go to other places aside from those 12 peaks?
The question is why do they go to those 12 peaks and not other places like that? It's a little bit unclear. I would say that there was a massive research effort in the beginning of the mid-'80s to 2000s where the NASA scientists and some of the monarch scientists, they first characterized what it was biophysically about the places where we know they go. And then they looked on maps in central Mexico and they sort of said, if we go to, where are the other places that are like this? And it's not like there's an infinite, there are not a ton of those places, but there are others, just like you said. And monarchs were not found at any of those other places. So there's various theories out there about other things that attract them to these particular places. And it's not, I maybe exaggerate a little bit, it's not just 12, it's the 12 that are most common that they're at. I think they've only ever been found, the clusters, at 22 sites, and there's 12 in which they're sort of repeatedly found. But there's many that one would predict should be occupied, but they're not. There's a question outside.
I was wondering, where do we go from here? What can we do with this information? Planting milkweed may help. You said maybe that's not the problem. Avoiding pesticides, herbicides. What do you think? What can we all do? What are our takeaways?
I think that those are, yeah, I think that certainly reducing the amount of toxins we put into the environment is a good thing to be doing. I would say there's the small things that we can all do, and I think we know what a lot of those are, whether they're directly related to monarchs or not. Unfortunately, and gosh, somebody called me an optimist earlier. I'm not sure, I think that fundamentally, the monarch is a little bit, it's like a sentinel about, for the health of our continent. And the little things that we do aren't changing that very long-term trajectory. In California, the decline of monarchs is documented to be 45 years. And it predates GMOs, it predates all kinds of other things. So I think until we, really grapple with the hard questions about what we're doing to the environment and control large-scale pollutants, and we have large-scale preservation, that we'll be putting little Band-Aids on things. And we should continue to do that. I do that. I drive a Prius. I mean, cut me a break. That's not helping. But we do it nonetheless because the small things we hope in aggregate will make some impact. And in the meantime, I think we have to press the people that are in charge to really make bigger, harder decisions. And we have to be willing to pay more for the things we want and that kind of stuff. Whew. Did I just say all that?
I have a question. What growing conditions do you need to be planting the milkweed?
The question is, what growing conditions do you need to plant the common milkweed? Almost anything. I mean, it's really, it's a vigorous plant. So the one thing I think that gardeners sometimes don't like is that it's a highly spreading plant, the common milkweed. So it often tillers, and in a couple of years you have a lot of it. If you're planting a very small plant, you might want to weed around it and loosen the soil around it. But after taking hold for one summer, you'll have it for a long time. It can grow in rocky, it can grow in pretty wet. It doesn't like standing water. But there's another milkweed species, the swamp milkweed, that likes standing water. So,
well, I've been trying to grow it, and I can't seem to do it. But where my brother lives here in the town of Clinton, it grows right along the road, and
yeah.
Within water and everything else, and I can't get to grow.
Yeah. I'm not sure about your specific case, but go ahead.
Yes, can you hear this?
I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. I think I have two observations. One of them is rather theoretical. Given the coevolution of the plant and the insect, the plant's perennial. The genetic recombination is going to be rather slow compared to not an annual, but 4 generations of the animal. It would follow, it seems to me, that the butterfly, in this case, would have an advantage, and over time would have a competitive advantage, so that it would tend to win that battle. And that's a theoretical observation. The second, I think, is a practical observation. I have land in Maine, and it's a rather large piece of land. And sequentially over the years, I clear one part or another part or another part. And when I do that, and I do that in July, and so come August, September, the milkweed which reemerges is young. Mm-hmm. That is where the butterflies go. They don't go to the old milkweed. They always go to the young milkweed. And in proliferation, there you'll find hundreds of them. So that's the practical and the theoretical.
Yeah, so the theoretical question was, is the monarch winning because it has 4 generations a year and the milkweed only has, not only does it not have 1 generation, it's a long-lived perennial. That's a long-standing, I'd say, I don't know about mystery. In general, in biology and in coevolution, people have modeled coevolution and have come up with the hypothesis that you have. There's various reasons why, the plants might be able to persist or keep up. I'd say it doesn't appear that there's a winner or a loser in this case, in the sense that the plants are doing just fine. But it's an excellent theoretical observation that professionals have worried about as well. The one thing I'd say that's really interesting about the monarch in that regard is because when it's in Texas, it's on 2 milkweed species that are not the common milkweed. And then later it's on the common milkweed. And 10% of them are on some of those other 125 milkweed species. That kind of limits their ability to be really strongly locally adapted to our common milkweed. And that's something we've begun to do research on ourselves, that you can just imagine that 90% of them make to Mexico come on the common milkweed, but then 85% of them in their first generation are on Asclepias viridis or Asperula, 2 different species, very different toxin profiles. And again, 10 or 15% of them are on these other ones. So that makes it tougher for them. With regard to your practical observation, which was that monarchs really prefer to lay eggs on regrown milkweeds, that is another excellent observation. It's been widely made. Monarchs typically will only lay 1 egg on each milkweed plant, but if they find a milkweed that is regrown from being mowed or grazed, they'll often lay 3 or 4 or more. It has been suggested as a management strategy. We can get more eggs out of monarchs if we mow fields in July. It's a little, the benefits of using that strategy are a little bit unclear to me, in the sense that yes, they would lay more eggs. It's unclear to me whether that would result in more monarchs or more healthier monarchs, but that's an excellent observation. And many people, and I see it myself in the same way that you have. Yeah. One more question, folks. Go ahead.
It's a related question. This tropical versus native milkweed.
Yeah.
Late October in New York City, in the park near my house, there were about 8 or 10 monarchs still in the butterfly garden there.
Yes.
Still mating and laying eggs, and
Yeah.
which we thought was kind of late in the year. And they had mainly tropical milkweed there. So the gardener and I were talking about it, and she's thinking of just ripping that out so
Yeah.
that they leave. Shouldn't they have been already on their way?
Yeah. So the question is about these late caterpillars and butterflies that are often around, or that can be around in October, and their relationship, if any, to tropical milkweed, which is a not native milkweed, but that's a very easy to grow ornamental. And I think there's 2 things there that are related. The first is that in any given year, there are always monarch caterpillars and butterflies, into October, and they're not making it. In my dark moments, I think of them as the living dead, because they, if they don't leave here by mid-September, they're not making it to Mexico. That work has been done. Especially in very large population boom years, the way the summer of 2018 was, that tail end of the distribution is large. I mean, there were I got a lot of emails from people, with the butterflies that they wanted to help. And the insanity of it was all kinds of butterflies were FedExed to Oklahoma and Texas to help them. But the second part of your question has to do with tropical milkweed, and there is now growing evidence, like scientific strong evidence, that when migrating monarchs encounter flowering tropical milkweed, Asclepias curassavica, it arrests them, and they stay and they nectar for a few days, and then they mature their reproductive organs. They're actually in reproductive diapause. They haven't matured their organs, but and then they lay eggs there. And that's happening in Los Angeles and Texas and in Florida quite a lot. It's unclear to me whether that can or is happening here. I mean, tropical milkweed doesn't survive the winter, I don't think, even in New York City. So probably, But, you know, they sell it.
It seems to be late blooming, like I noticed it blooms
Yeah.
later than the native milkweed.
Yeah. And you can keep watering it and it'll just continue to bloom. So in general, I'd say there's no real reason to be planting tropical milkweed, except that it's a little bit easier. And if we're trying to help in any way, shape, or form, we might as well try to plant the native ones. And there's now growing evidence, especially in the southern states, that it's really not a good thing there.
We have a bonus question because somebody already had the mic.
Okay, good.
Hi, I was just wondering what the similarity was between the life cycle of the different populations spread out across the globe. Do they have the same cycle, and do they start and end up in similar environments?
The question is, how is the life cycle of the monarch different in the different populations around the globe? Really great question. So they're non-migratory in Spain. They are non-migratory in Florida. Obviously, in California, they have a different migration than they do in the east. In New Zealand and Australia, they have an entirely different migration, different season. They go different places. And I would guess that's not really evolution. That is that these are remarkably crafty, what we say in scientific terms, phenotypically plastic organisms, that they're getting cues of day length and temperature, they're taking off, and they're finding places. But it is crazy and wonderful. And in these different populations, they have different numbers of generations per year. So we have 3 to 4 here. There's a different number. I think it's 1 fewer in California. There are more in Florida. They're doing different things. It's really cool.
So can we thank Dr. Agrawal again for...